CEO, Oculus, John Carmack.
This is going to be amazingly cool.
They fired Chief of Oculus, Palmer Luckey.
Our company is now Meta.
They really haven't been satisfied with the pace of progress that we've been making.
Hello and welcome to Wednesday Newsday, your #1 resource for the entire week's worth of VR news. Okay, so this is going to be an interesting news day, and I'll be honest, this one's been a long time coming. Of course, we've got some fun stuff to talk about. Quest 3 talks, consumer haptic gloves are on their way, HTC's new headset, a really good-looking VR game was announced, but something way bigger has recently happened to Meta and Oculus and Reality Labs. And I think it's pretty safe to say that the current era of VR has come to a close. And I'd be lying if I didn't say that this is a bit of a scary moment for the entire industry. So let me explain what's going on and what it means for all of us and what it's likely going to mean for the future of VR. And then we'll talk about some of the other fun stuff that happened. We've got a lot to talk about, so let's just get right into the news. You probably are aware of one of the biggest jokes in the entire VR industry. And in case you're not, let me just fill you in. For around the past 30 years or so, VR as a technology has had these massive waves of public excitement as promises of exploring virtual worlds are made by companies that are passionate about the medium. And just about every single time when that wave of excitement inevitably crashes, the same 3 words are constantly thrown around as the punchline. And you may recognize them: VR is dead. And right now, VR is experiencing a pretty significant decline in general consumer interest. It's not up for debate, it's just happening right now. And we can talk about exactly why at a later point, but if there's any time recently that general people are saying that VR is dead, now is that time. But we've been here before. And I think a way better way to talk about all of this is to introduce a concept that is very well known, especially in the technology industry. And it explains all of these hype cycles. And it explains the ups and downs of every industry and what we're feeling right now. And it's called the Gartner hype cycle. For some of you, this will be a brand new revelation level of information, like everything will just make sense. And for the rest of you, you already know this cycle very well. But it's really worth talking about, especially with the news that I'm about to drop. And I think it's also important to recognize that VR itself is just such an interesting technology that truly is capable of changing so many industries, that because of that potential, VR itself has gone through these massive hype cycles more than almost anything else out there. It's a constant cycle of birth and death and rebirth. And when it's said that VR is dead, it really just usually means that we're in one of these oscillations of the hype cycle, that we're in something that's usually called a trough of disillusionment. So let me just very quickly sum up the past decade of the VR industry using this Gartner hype cycle as a guide. There are 5 basic phases of hype for everything. The innovation trigger is the first one, which can easily be equated to the Oculus Kickstarter about 10 years ago. VR was now possible with current technology, leading to a peak of inflated expectations. That being the HTC Vive and Oculus Rift hype cycle that made people really excited for VR around 2015 to 2016. And then, as you may remember, the subsequent trough of disillusionment following headsets being really expensive, requiring a PC and the software being extremely limited. If you remember, everyone was saying VR was dead in 2017. This was that phenomenon. And after that comes what's called a slope of enlightenment, a period of exploration, more realistic expectations, and a time of innovation usually, then finally ending in a plateau of productivity, something that I'm sure that you'd recognize. And you could say that the next VR hype cycle started in 2020 and then just repeated this whole thing. The innovation trigger being the Quest and Quest 2 being standalone VR headsets, solving all the issues. No PC requirement while also a global pandemic was locking everybody into their homes. Meta and kind of everyone got way too excited about the metaverse, driving inflated expectations through the roof. And now, post all that hype, we're almost certainly in another trough of disillusionment. The general tech market is down, the metaverse is decades away, not months away, the Quest 2 is okay. People expected grand worlds, not PlayStation 2 Horizon worlds. But we're now on our way towards a slow slope of enlightenment. And I expect that the Quest 3 and PSVR 2 and Deckard and all the titles coming in 2023 will bring a pretty true plateau of productivity. So why am I even saying this or explaining all of this? Well, we've just experienced and gotten out of an awesome hype period in VR. Things have been great. Millions of headsets sold, billions of dollars of software sold, lots of excitement. But right now, the entire VR industry is admittedly in a pretty scary spot. Sales are down, Meta is way down, and the excitement that was fueling this exponential growth curve has slowed down quite a bit. It's noticeable. And because of all of this, there have already been and there will be lots more claims that VR is dead or lame or didn't follow through with the expectations. And rather than just shunning everything away, I think it's way easier to digest when you have a better understanding of how these markets usually work, and that this is all normal. It's okay. And as scary of a time as this may feel like, it's also one of the most exciting times to be in the VR industry. And I'll explain why in a second, but now it's time for the big news and why people are kind of freaking out. John Carmack, the consulting CTO of Oculus and also the co-founder of id Games behind Wolfenstein and Doom and Quake, has announced that after an 8-year stint of working with Oculus and Meta on VR, that his decade in VR has concluded and that he is leaving the company to focus on other endeavors. But he didn't just leave, instead dropping an internal memo that's now leaked, sharing his dissatisfaction with Meta and the VR industry and how they've shaped up. And some of his quotes from that internal memo are particularly harsh and revealing and concerning, saying that Meta and Oculus are operating at, quote, half of the effectiveness, and has a ridiculous amount of people and resources, but we constantly are self-sabotaging and squandering effort, end quote. And while I personally and many other VR interested people haven't always agreed with everything John Carmack says, he's not a god of VR, he has been known to be a strong internal voice at Meta that challenges the yes man internal structure. The internal structure that led to the $700 million value loss at Meta and resulted in 11,000 people being laid off recently. So, seeing Carmack leave, while not the end of the world, is a very troubling and concerning thing for the company and future of Oculus and Meta and inherently VR itself. And Andrew Bosworth, the current CTO of Meta, responded in a public memo titled "Why We Still Believe in the Future." And sorry to be comical here, but I'd really hope that you'd still believe in the future. But anyways, the memo is basically a reflection of the past year, acknowledging that 2022 was probably the hardest year for Meta yet, which I'd agree with, and explains that they're not necessarily going to be cutting back, instead finding ways to be more efficient in the future. Bosworth also mentioning that half of the Reality Lab's spending is going towards AR, with a big push for mixed reality in the future. And of course, it was also mentioned that Quest 3 or some sort of follow-up to Quest 2 is on its way and sometime soon, but we kind of already knew that. And as honestly unsubstantial as this memo was, there is one set of lines that I really like, and it has to do with VR being in kind of a bad spot right now. But it's also an incredibly exciting spot. Quote, "VR is at a very special moment. Fundamental new pieces of the hardware and technology stack are hitting the market for the first time, and a community of developers and users is unlocking its potential in new ways," end quote. And that to me, while I don't necessarily agree with Boz on many things, is a pretty good way to put it. A lot of people thought that this most recent wave of hype was going to propel VR way up here in the stars, but instead, we're somewhere around here. And growth was stunted not by any other reason than the fact that VR needs more experimentation, it needs more organic growth, it needs more developers, and it needs more development, and it needs the people that are passionate enough to learn, build, and be okay with failing before you succeed. And VR doesn't need to be this hyper super mainstream thing to be a healthy industry. And now we're truly on our way towards a slope of enlightenment. We've never had good VR hardware this cheap, with so many competitors on the way and with this many studios working on games. And I'm excited to see where this will all land us. Now is a time to experiment and build. And this won't be the last time that we're here in this trough of disillusionment. Like I said earlier, VR is a crazy enough technology that no matter what, the pursuit and passion to create crazy virtual worlds and experiences, and not to reject reality, but to instead explore virtual imagination, is so strong that VR will never die. We are just in a constant rebirth cycle that gets better every time. And as the saying goes, VR is dead, and long live VR. Because as anybody will say, whether you've been in VR for a long time or you're brand new here or you're an engineer working on VR, we've still got a long way to go and a lot to learn. But what we have right now is still pretty freaking cool. And no matter what, I'll still be here sharing that really cool part. But now it's time for a meme break. The next quest killer is going to work out. Honest, rest in peace, Pico 4, but also not really. Meta is legitimately like the 90% market leader, so even if Pico only takes off 1 or 2% as a dent in their market share, it's still a big deal. And taking away market share from a massive market leader takes time. Just because a headset doesn't sell 20 million units right away in a downturn and beat the Quest 2 doesn't mean it's not worth being excited about. But this is still pretty funny and something I'm a little guilty of. But now back to the news. And contrary to the negative first part of this video, we have some really fun stuff to go over. The VR community erupted into backlash after Virtual Desktop, one of the most widely used applications on the Quest 2, announced a pretty huge update bringing a 20% increase in PC VR performance, with an equally huge caveat. The update adds a requirement for a constant internet connection to use the software, with Guy's reason being, quote, "This is unfortunate, but piracy has become a real problem, and this is the only way I can keep bringing you free updates for life," end quote. And the community using Virtual Desktop subsequently review bombed and lashed out against Guy, which is understandable. It's never a good precedent to make your entire user base suffer because of the action of the few or a few pirates. So Guy actually reverted that decision to instead only require an internet connection at the time of each update to check the license is legit. And while any DRM of any kind really sucks, this is a way better situation now. But I also wanted to mention very seriously, please do not pirate VR stuff in general. This is a very small industry and every single sale matters immensely to developers. But at the same time, please developers don't start adding this online only DRM that's toxic. It commonly doesn't even fix the real problem, just makes the entire experience for everybody worse. So like, let's just be nice to each other and save up for games and stuff. But anyways, the problem is more or less solved if you have a legit license, and you'll get to enjoy that 20% performance improvement. But seriously, good job community on saying this wasn't cool, and good job on Guy for rolling it back. Skydance Interactive, the studio behind the Walking Dead Saints and Sinners, have showcased a teaser for their newest VR game in a brand new VR IP, Behemoth. And while this is only a cinematic trailer, this is not gameplay, it's looking to be really, really cool. And I'm getting some Skyrim vibes, and it should be releasing for all platforms next year. So for years now, I've been looking for a decent way to kick controllers to the side for VR, at least for some experiences like VR chat, but there are some inherent big challenges to making hand tracking or gloves viable, like locomotion or buttons or tracking. But Tokyo-based DiverX, the pioneers behind the previously kind of weird but ambitious and never launched Half Dive, have announced a Kickstarter for a set of Steam VR tracked gloves called the Contact Glove. And I actually had the opportunity to try an early version of these in Japan on my trip, and I'll post that video at some point. And I really enjoyed using them for things like VR chat, the Pro model even featuring haptic feedback on the fingertips, using a Tundra tracker for base station tracking, and you're able to move around using a button emulation on the fingers themselves. It's really interesting. And while it did take me a minute to get used to, they're probably some of the best gloves that I've used so far for this. But definitely hold up for a moment before hitting up that Kickstarter, because I do have a pair of gloves on the way to make a full video, and they should be arriving in the next couple weeks. So if you're interested in using gloves in VR rather than controllers, definitely keep on the lookout for that video. HTC Vive recently properly showed off their newest VR headset, and it seems to be exactly what we were expecting after Bradley's leaks, an extremely light and small Vive Flow style headset with full 6-off tracking and a depth sensor. We still don't know much on price or any other specifics, but HTC did say that they will be announcing and giving demos of the headset at this year's CES, an event that I do plan on attending. So keep on the lookout for that at the beginning of the year. And something interesting is that pretty much everyone is saying that this is going to be a Quest competitor, but I have a feeling that the price is going to be quite a bit more than the Quest, so I guess we'll just have to see in January. And it's been a hot minute since there's been good VR news worth making a whole video on, so there's no question of the week, but you can still ask me anything down below and I'll answer one of them next week. But I did want to mention something I'm really excited about. Virtually Odd will be making a comeback next year, as I've been getting my hands on a lot of really exciting VR hardware, and believe me, some of the stuff is truly odd. So I'm excited to go back to the grassroots for a little bit and make some fun hardware videos. And let me know if there's anything in particular that you'd like to see, because I'll find it and I'll get my hands on it and I'll make a video. And I hope you enjoyed this week of VR news. Lots of interesting stuff, and we've got a pretty interesting future industry ahead of us. And I'm curious to see how Meta operates without someone like John Carmack at one of the helm. Can't tell if it's going to be a disaster, if there's going to be no change, or, you know, who knows. But I did want to say thank you to all my Patreon supporters. I couldn't do any of this without you, especially my Omegas. Thank you again. And don't forget to like this video if you loved it, subscribe if you want more of this, and hit that freaking bell if you just can't live without it. Much love, Thrill out.